So it's been 3 days since the season finale of Andor, and I've had some time to rewatch key scenes and episodes, and to really let it all sink in and think about just how good of a series it has been and where it might rank compared to the other entries within the Star Wars franchise. When I heard Tony Gilroy and the team behind Rogue One were involved in this show, I expected it to be great, but having seen the low standards set by other Disney series involving some of its most beloved characters, I must say I kinda kept my expectations in check. The writers had a really tough task ahead of them. They had to get a fan base that has been largely disgruntled and uninspired by modern Star Wars projects to buy into a story which contained none of the legacy characters or lore. They had to get us invested into a set of ordinary characters instead. And that's where the real magic of Andor actually lies. When it came to depiction of good and evil in previous Star Wars series and films, I always felt they had taken an approach that was very surface level. The Empire felt one-dimensionally evil, often portrayed as simply some caricature of the Nazis, with very little effort given to the actual people who were part of it, and even less interest shown to how the bureaucracy of the Empire would work. Then on the other side, the rebellion was always depicted as this movement of heroes, of knights in shining armor, of, just the do-gooders. There wasn't really anyone who was particularly getting their hands dirty. There was never a sort of a ruthlessness to the rebellion that made them sometimes as bad as the Empire. It seems to me that the focus of the writers from the very start of the show was to immerse us in a complex world and create characters with realistic relationships and motivations. Not only do we get to see characters in their everyday life, but we also get to see them in a family setting. This humanizes them and adds a much needed complexity and realism that I always found lacking in modern Star Wars. While there is the odd weak character here and there, the core group of characters are not only really well written, but also brilliantly cast. There's a lot of great character actors that Andor plucked from other great shows like Game of Thrones and Chernobyl. For example, the Chief Inspector is Lord Royce, Vel is the Waif, and Major Partagaz is Qyburn. And then we've got Linus Mosk, who was the baddest miner in Chernobyl, and the ISB spy who was one of the plant operators. And then of course, we have the legend himself, Stellan Skarsgård, who kinda seems to turn every character he touches into gold lately. The rest of the cast is filled with relative newcomers as well as established industry veterans that really breathe life into characters that often serve as the emotional backbone of the story. Skarsgård's Luthen is probably the biggest standout of the show, especially in his speech in episode 10, which might be the best monologue in all of Star Wars, really. Luthen is a force of nature. He's pragmatic, he's cunning, and often ruthless. He's a character that really sets the tone for Andor as a series. You can tell Tony Gilroy draws upon his experiences from writing spy thrillers like Michael Clayton and the Jason Bourne films. A lot of the time, he is more interested in showing the intricate details that lead to action rather than showing the action itself. A great example of this is the depiction of inner workings of the ISB, where we are shown a lot of the mundane staff meetings, but then when the robbery on Aldhani happens and suddenly everyone is called in to stay overnight, it adds to the stakes. This isn't just another robbery, this is a big deal. Everyone has been called in, and even the Emperor gets a name drop. Another example of this is Krieger's attack on Spellhouse. It is often talked about both prior and after it happening, but never actually shown on screen. Gilroy simply isn't interested in action for the sake of action. He knows that the schemes and plots that lead to action are often much more interesting and suspenseful. And so in Andor, the suspense isn't usually supplied through these bombastic action sequences that we've gotten used to in other Star Wars entries, but rather from the things that at first glance may seem rather ordinary, like efforts to secure financing, career struggles, and the inner workings of imperial institutions. When a dialogue between two characters can be more suspenseful than an action sequence, you know that the writing is really great. Although the plot itself is sometimes uneven in its pace, and as some of the episodes, especially in the first half of the season, lack action, I think it is only a matter of patience from the viewer. If a story drags a little longer in places, but in the end rewards my patience with a spectacular climax, all is forgotten on my part. The journey was worth it. And so I think complaints about Andor being boring are kind of unjustified. It delivers when it needs to. In fact, I'd say it often over-delivers. A good example of this is Ferrix. Throughout the show, the time we spend on Ferrix can seem dull. I often ask myself, why are we wasting time on this planet and these characters? I'd rather see what's going on in Coruscant. But then it all gets a payoff in a glorious season finale. The entire funeral sequence, along with the marching band and Marva's speech, would never pack the emotional punch if we haven't spent so much time with these characters in the first place. At the time of watching it, I also felt the show was spending too much time in the Narkina 5 prison. I thought it was, too much of a sidetrack from the overall plot. But then it all had this giant payoff in episode 10. Kino Loy's speech resonated way more than if the escape happened 2 episodes earlier. In the case of the prison, the payoff went even further with the post-credit scene at the end of the season, because it all came full circle in a rather poetic way. Cassian helped build the machine that would eventually kill him. The writing simply keeps a really high standard throughout the show, but steps up and becomes great when it needs to be, resulting in some truly memorable moments, like Kino's, Luthen's, and Marva's speeches, as already mentioned, but also just simple lines by characters like Brasso.
I love him more than anything he could ever do wrong.
Clea.
I don't have lately. I have always.
Or Karis's manifesto.
There will be times when the struggle seems impossible. I know this already. Alone, unsure, dwarfed by the scale of the enemy.
The sequence where Cassian is reading Karis's manifesto in the season finale really gave me the chills. Seeing Biggs alone and broken in the prison cell, Luthen contemplating his next steps, and Cassian looking inspired and determined. It all packs an incredible emotional punch, not only because it is really well written, but also because there's so much subtext here. Karis wrote the manifesto at a time when the rebellion was nothing more than a few enthusiasts. He wrote it at a time when the hope of seeing the Empire fall must have been at an all-time low. Yet, we know how this story turns out, we know what an instrumental role Cassian will end up playing, and we know that ultimately Karis's prediction will be right. Oppression and tyranny will be overwhelmed. Speaking of Biggs in prison, that's another example of Andor being mature and immersive in its reality. There's an entire backstory to how the Imperial torture machine works, and it is chilling. And so when we see her after the torture, it's way more emotional because it's all much more believable. The constant cutting to Biggs in prison during Marva's funeral parade is no accident. It adds another layer of emotional complexity to the plot. But I think there's more to why Andor is great than just the brilliant writing. It is the production quality and the creative choices that went into the production of this show. First and foremost, Tony Gilroy created a genre piece. Andor is a sci-fi spy thriller at its very core, and Star Wars kind of comes second to this. And it seems that every creative choice was made with that in mind. The choice is to not overly rely on green screen and bombastic CGI, but rather spend a big chunk of its budget to use a lot of live locations can really be felt here. Although you may not consciously think about it, there's definitely a subconscious process going on when you see characters reacting to a real environment. There's a physicality that these environments project onto the characters that cannot be artificially recreated in a studio. You can't capture the richness of this depth of sound of like the insects, the wind, the rain, without really filming on location. And then even artificial environments such as Coruscant, yes, surely there's a lot of CGI being used to fill in the background, but the core of these places have been filmed in real sets, in real locations. And so it always feels like it's grounded in reality. We also never see the giant wide establishing shots made up entirely out of CGI. Instead, we're put into a real location and into the character's perspective. Because we get to experience the character's journey mostly from their grounded point of view, the world feels much larger as we only get to see tiny fractions of it at a time. Now, of course, that's not to say that there aren't any shots that seem larger than life or that CGI is never used as a foundation for certain sequences. On the contrary, the cinematography and visual effects of Andor are beautiful and often poetic. The depiction of Coruscant in particular is my personal favorite. It seems just larger than life. We only see Coruscant from the perspective of characters inhabiting it. We even get to see the lower levels, which I think was really cool. And I always wish that Star Wars would try and evoke a bit of Blade Runner in its depiction of the world to give it this more of a cyberpunk feel. Andor gives us a little taste of it, and I really hope that we'll see more of it in future seasons, especially when we visit other planets that perhaps will really suit the style even more. The last thing I wanted to touch on is the sound, which, there's been a really high bar set by most of the Star Wars films in terms of sound design, but I don't think the Star Wars series themselves have really been up there, But Andor does an amazing job of mixing artificial sounds and using a lot of real sounds, as I've already mentioned, by using real locations. There's just a lot of interaction with real environments that create real sounds and just further promote this immersion that I've been already talking about so much. And then there's the soundtrack. Nicholas Brittle does such a good job here. There's, for example, a track that plays throughout the show and in multiple places as sort of a galaxy hit. You know, it's these tiny details that just, once again, just create this grounded reality. And then there's the soundtrack itself. It doesn't necessarily stand out, but it really packs a punch when it needs to, you know? This is never felt more clearly than in episodes 10 and 12, objectively the two best episodes, whose climaxes are perfectly complemented by a really powerful score. In both cases, I had the chills multiple times. You know, I could keep going on and on about this, but I don't want this video to be like 20 minutes long. All I want to say is that Andor is special. It made me excited about the Star Wars universe, unlike anything I've seen in a very long time. Tony Gilroy gave us Star Wars that goes beyond the laser swords, beyond the space battles, and the legendary journey of a special few. It explores complex, mature themes and makes creative choices to further complement those themes. It gave us a set of incredible new characters that we weren't used to seeing in Star Wars before. And because of this, I think Andor is the best Star Wars has been in 40 years. Thank you for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel and see you in the next one.